"You're too rigid for our future, Ethan," Sophia declared to the stunned management team, her voice cutting through the Friday morning meeting. No private talk, no warning. Every department head's eyes burned into me. "My name is Ethan Harper, 50 years old, operations director at Steel Pulse Technologies for 8 years until about 10 minutes ago." I nodded once, closed my laptop, and said, "Understood." The room's silence screamed louder than Sophia's words, her gaze daring me to react. Sophia had been president for all of 10 weeks, brought in by investors who wanted someone with vision and presence to make the company more attractive for acquisition. She wore tailored blazers, used phrases like dynamic scalability, and had never once visited our production floor. I cleared my office, without argument, 25 minutes flat. One cardboard box for personal items, another for the binders I'd meticulously built over 8 years, supplier contacts, cost frameworks, logistics schedules, the invisible architecture holding everything together. "Ethan, this isn't personal," Sophia said, appearing in my doorway as I packed, her voice softer now that we were alone. "You're holding us back, Ethan," she added, her eyes cold despite the smile. "We just need someone with a more collaborative approach." I kept packing. The past 5 quarters speak for themselves. Numbers aren't everything in modern business. "Your numbers won't save you," she whispered, leaning closer, her words a calculated jab. I didn't bother explaining that those numbers, the $15 million in annual revenue, up from $6 million, 0 cents when I started, came from relationships, from trust, built slowly, methodically with suppliers across the Northwest, from handshakes and site visits, and remembering names of people's kids. Sophia wouldn't understand that my rigid leadership style was what kept raw materials arriving on time during the supply chain crisis of 2024, that my outdated processes were why we could price our products 8% lower than competitors and still maintain strong margins. I shook hands with my team on the way out, wished them success. I meant it. "Don't let her ruin this place," my deputy Clara whispered, her grip tight with unspoken fury. Good people who deserved better than what was coming. On the drive home, my phone lit up with messages, shocked colleagues, confused vendors who'd already somehow heard. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned toward the Columbia River and parked at an overlook. The water churned below, mirroring the storm I buried inside. For the first time in 8 years, I had nowhere to be at 2:00 p.m. on a Friday. "Congratulations on your freedom," I muttered to myself, watching barges push against the current below. I knew what would happen next. I'd seen this movie before. The first hints were already there in Sophia's office, the MBA jargon, the supplier portal software she'd mentioned implementing, the consulting firm she'd brought in to streamline procurement. "We're modernizing, Ethan," she'd boasted, her tone dismissing years of my work. What she didn't know was that every major supplier contract was personally negotiated by me, built on handshakes and mutual respect, not software platforms. There was no transition plan because nobody had asked for one, and now nobody ever would. I joined Steel Pulse when they were a struggling outfit in an old warehouse near the port. Their product line, Precision Industrial Automation Systems, was solid, but they couldn't deliver consistently enough to land major contracts. The owner, Walter Grayson, was an engineering genius with no mind for logistics. "I need someone who can fix this damn supply chain mess," Walter had told me during my interview, pointing to a whiteboard covered in delivery delays and cost overruns. "You're my last shot, Harper," he'd said, his voice raw with desperation. "You military guys understand systems. Make this work and I'll make it worth your while." After 17 years as a logistics officer in the Navy, I knew how to build reliable supply chains. Not by bullying vendors into submission, that never works long-term, but by creating mutual dependency partnerships where both sides had skin in the game. I spent that first year on the road, visited every critical supplier personally, learned their capabilities, their constraints, their aspirations. "You're the first suit who cares about our shop," a Benz supplier told me, sealing our deal over coffee. Some were small family operations in places like Bend, Oregon or Missoula, Montana. Others were divisions of larger corporations where the right relationship with a purchasing manager meant priority status during shortages. By year 3, we had the region's most robust supply network. When competitors were shutting down production lines due to part shortages, we kept running. Our delivery reliability hit 99.1%. Customer retention reached 93%. Walter understood the value. "Whatever you're doing with these suppliers, keep doing it," he'd say at our monthly reviews. "You're the backbone of this company," he'd add it once, clapping my shoulder with pride. "Best investment I ever made was bringing you on." But Walter sold the company last summer. Said he was ready to retire, golf more, see his grandkids. "I'm trusting you to keep her steady, Ethan," he'd said, his voice heavy with reluctance. The investment group that bought Steel Pulse immediately started professionalizing operations. New software, new reporting structures, new KPIs, and finally, Sophia. The first crack appeared during her second week. She canceled my quarterly supplier visit trip, calling it an inefficient expense in the digital era. "Face-to-face is outdated," she snapped, waving off my protest with a smirk. The second came during a strategy meeting where she dismissed my concerns about changing payment terms with key vendors. "They'll adapt," she said confidently. "We're too important to them." The third was overhearing her tell someone on the phone that operations was stuck in the last century and needed fresh blood. "Harper's a relic," she sneered, her words slicing through the office door. I could have fought harder, could have explained that our success was built on precisely the old-school approach she was dismantling, that our suppliers worked with us because of trust, not just transactions. But I recognized the pattern. I'd seen it in the military too. New leadership determined to make their mark by changing what already works. So I started making copies of my contact lists, backing up my notes, preparing for the inevitable. "You're guarding something, Ethan," my assistant Daniel whispered one night, catching me archiving files. When it came, the only surprise was the public nature of my dismissal. 4 days after my firing, James Carter called, chief engineer at Nexus Dynamics, one of our biggest customers. "Heard what happened?" "Their loss," he said. "Sophia's a fool to let you go," he growled, his tone thick with disdain. "Listen, you free for lunch? No agenda. Just two old guys complaining about the world." We met at a barbecue joint downtown. James was pushing 62 with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades building things before moving into management. "So what's next for Ethan Harper?" he asked after we ordered. "Taking some time, evaluating options." James nodded. "Heard from anyone at Steel Pulse?" Radio silence, not surprised. "Sophia's already making waves. Announced a new vendor management system yesterday. Mandatory for all suppliers." He studied my face. "You didn't set that up, did you?" "No. All our vendor relationships were personal, direct lines of communication, real people solving real problems." "That's what I figured." James leaned forward. "Your absence is already breaking them," he said, his eyes sharp with warning. "Look, Ethan, I'm going to be straight with you. We're already seeing delays from Steel Pulse. Nothing major yet, but the warning signs are there. Your replacement is some kid from business school who talks about strategic sourcing but doesn't know the difference between a servo motor and a stepper motor." "He's already botching orders," James added, his voice dripping with contempt. I took a sip of water, trying to mask my reaction. It was happening faster than I'd expected. "Not your problem anymore," James continued, "but here's what's interesting. Cascade Systems is looking for someone to overhaul their operations. Their CEO, Margaret Ellison, is an old friend. When I heard what happened to you, I mentioned your name. You're too good to waste, Ethan," he said, his gaze steady with conviction. "I appreciate that, but she wants to meet you. They're expanding, and their current setup can't handle the growth." Sound familiar? It did. Exactly like Steel Pulse 8 years ago. As we finished lunch, my phone buzzed. A text from Walter, my old boss. "Just heard. What the hell were they thinking? Call me." "They'll regret this, Ethan." His message continued, fueling my resolve. On the drive home, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, I was past that. Something colder, more calculated. Sophia had made a critical error. She'd assumed the systems I built were transferable, that relationships could be managed through software and form emails, that suppliers would stick with Steel Pulse out of inertia or necessity. Her arrogance would be her downfall, I thought, gripping the wheel tighter. She didn't understand that I'd structured every major contract to require personal renegotiation annually. No auto-renewals, no standard terms, each one customized with me as the point of contact. It wasn't sabotage, it was how I'd always operated. Personal accountability built into the system. My system. That evening, I received my first email from Steel Pulse since the firing. Not from Sophia, but from purchasing. Urgent. Need vendor contact information for Northwest Components. Their representative says they only deal with Ethan Harper. They're already crumbling without you, I muttered, deleting the email unread. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Walter back, then Margaret Ellison at Cascade Systems, then 3 other companies who'd tried to hire me away over the years. By Monday, I had 4 solid offers. By Wednesday, I'd made my decision. I wasn't just going to rebuild somewhere else. I was going to show Sophia exactly what she'd thrown away. 3 weeks after my firing, I accepted the Chief Operations Officer position at Cascade Systems. They manufactured advanced medical imaging equipment, different products from Steel Pulse, but similar supply chain challenges. Margaret Ellison, their CEO, gave me full authority to rebuild their operations from the ground up. "We need what you built at Steel Pulse," she said during our final interview. "You're our chance to outshine the competition," she added, her voice charged with ambition. "Our growth is outpacing our infrastructure. Fix it, and there's equity in it for you." I spent my first day walking the floor, talking to line workers, getting the unfiltered truth about what worked and what didn't. "We've been limping along too long," a veteran technician grumbled, his frustration palpable. By day 3, I had identified their critical weaknesses: inconsistent component deliveries, quality variations from key suppliers, and inefficient inventory practices. That Monday, my personal phone rang. Sophia Reed's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was polite but strained. "Ethan, hope you're well. We're having some challenges with supplier transitions, wondering if you might be available for a brief consultation. Compensated, of course." "She's desperate," I muttered, hearing the tremor in her voice. I didn't call back. Tuesday morning, my administrative assistant forwarded an email that had come through the general contact form. "Urgent request from Sophia Reed, President of Steel Pulse Technologies." "She's begging for your help," my assistant noted, her tone laced with irony. I deleted it without reading further. By Friday, she was calling my personal phone every few hours. I blocked her number. On Saturday, she showed up at Cascade's reception area. "Mr. Harper is in meetings all day," the receptionist told her, following my standing instructions for any Steel Pulse visitors. "Tell him it's urgent," Sophia insisted. "We have a major production delay that's about to cost us millions." I watched her pace on the security feed, her polished facade unraveling with every step. I watched through the security feed from my office as she waited for 45 minutes before leaving, her perfect composure finally cracking. That afternoon, I received a detailed email from Daniel Foster, my former assistant at Steel Pulse. We'd stayed in touch, and he'd become my eyes and ears inside the company. "Complete chaos," he wrote. "Northwest Components raise prices 18% on the new contract. Pacific Parts push delivery dates out 8 weeks. 3 other vendors have capacity issues that mysteriously only affect Steel Pulse orders. Sophia's losing control," Daniel added, his words a grim confirmation of her downfall. "Sophia's called 5 emergency management meetings this week alone." I hadn't asked these vendors to punish Steel Pulse. I hadn't needed to. They'd seen how I was treated and drawn their own conclusions about the new leadership. "Your name still carries weight, Ethan," a vendor had told me years ago, his loyalty now haunting Sophia's reign. Some had worked with me for years across multiple companies. They knew who kept promises and who didn't. The next morning, Walter Grayson called. "The board is starting to ask questions," he said. Walter had kept a 12% stake in Steel Pulse after selling. "Sophia's blaming vendor hostility for the delays. Says you poisoned the well on your way out." "She's spinning lies to save herself," Walter growled, his voice thick with disgust. "I've had 0 contact with any Steel Pulse vendors since I left," I replied truthfully. "I believe you, but she's convinced herself she's the victim here." Walter paused. "They lost the Triton contract yesterday. Couldn't guarantee delivery dates. Triton Enterprises, a client I'd personally cultivated for 4 years before they finally signed on, one of Steel Pulse's largest accounts. That one hurt her," Walter added, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "Not my concern anymore," I said. "Of course not," Walter agreed. "By the way, how's the new gig? Different challenges, similar solutions." I hesitated. I might need to bring on some additional manufacturing capacity soon. Know anyone looking to sublease factory space? Walter chuckled. You're plotting something, aren't you, Harper? He teased, his voice warm with mischief. Funny you should ask. I might have some leverage to help with that very soon. A week later, I received a formal letter from Steel Pulse's legal department claiming I had violated non-solicitation agreements by interfering with their vendor relationships. They're grasping at straws, Margaret scoffed when I showed her the letter. I forwarded it to Margaret's legal team without comment. Their response came back within hours. No merit, no evidence, no concern. They were right. I hadn't solicited anyone. I had simply stepped aside and let reality take its course. That night, I slept better than I had in months. A month into my new role at Cascade, I received a message on LinkedIn from Catherine Walsh, Steel Pulse's head of finance. We'd worked well together during my time there. Both of us detail-oriented, process-driven professionals who preferred results over politics, and we meet, was all she wrote. I can't stay silent anymore, her message hinted, a spark of defiance in her words. We chose a coffee shop halfway between our offices. Catherine looked exhausted. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from fighting unwinnable battles. They're blaming you for everything, she said after we sat down. The vendor issues, the production delays, the lost contracts. Sophia's built this narrative that you sabotaged the company on your way out. She's painting you as the villain to save her skin, Catherine hissed, her eyes flashing with indignation. I stirred my coffee. That would require planning I didn't have time for, given the 10-minute notice of my termination. I know, but here's what you don't know. Catherine lowered her voice. It's a conspiracy, Ethan, she whispered, glancing nervously around the coffee shop. Sophia was brought in specifically to cut costs and prep the company for a quick flip. The investors want to sell within 15 months. They need to show consistent 22% margins. Steel Pulse was already profitable, I noted. Not profitable enough for them. Your vendor contracts were too fair. They protected both sides. She pulled out her tablet, opened a spreadsheet. Look at these targets. They need to squeeze an additional 15% out of the supply chain. It's corporate greed, she muttered, her fingers trembling as she swiped through the data. I studied the numbers. Impossible without gutting quality or shifting to overseas suppliers, which would create months of production gaps and destroy the company's reputation for reliability. There's more, Catherine continued. Sophia didn't fire you because of your leadership style. She fired you because you were the only one who would have challenged these targets. The rest of us were kept in the dark until after you were gone. That's why it was so public, I realized. A warning to everyone else, Catherine nodded. Exactly. And it worked. Nobody's pushing back. So why tell me this? She closed her tablet. Because I handed in my resignation yesterday. I'm not participating in what comes next. I'm done with their lies, she said, her voice breaking with defiance, and she hesitated. There's a board meeting next week. They're going to discuss emergency measures, including potentially closing Tacoma facility and moving production to Malaysia. 250 jobs gone. Walter won't let that happen, I said. Walter's being pressured to sell his remaining shares. They're making it very difficult for him to say no. They're threatening his legacy, she warned, her gaze heavy with urgency. I walked Catherine to her car, thanked her for the information, and drove straight to Walter's house. I found him in his garage tinkering with an old sailboat. They're going to gut the company, I told him, relaying what Catherine had shared. Walter put down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag. They're tearing apart my life's work, he growled, his eyes blazing with betrayal. I've been feeling the squeeze. Bastards want my shares at 12% below what they're worth. Don't sell. Easy for you to say. You're not getting calls from their lawyers every day. They're hounding me like vultures, he spat, tossing the rag aside. I leaned against his workbench. What if there was another option? What if Cascade acquired Steel Pulse instead? Walter stared at me. You're serious? Margaret's looking to expand. She needs manufacturing capacity. Steel Pulse needs leadership that values what it's built. It makes sense. Sophia's investors wouldn't sell to you. Too much ego involved now? They would if Steel Pulse was on the verge of collapse. If their only hope of recovering their investment was a fire sale. You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan, Walter said, his voice low with intrigue. I met his eyes. How long until the cash flow problems become critical? Walter thought for a moment. At the current burn rate, 5 weeks, maybe 7, and if key suppliers continue to have capacity issues, if more customers followed Triton out the door, a slow smile spread across Walter's face. "Ethan Harper, you calculating son of a gun. You're out for blood, aren't you?" he chuckled, a spark of admiration in his eyes. "I'm not suggesting anything unethical," I clarified. "I'm merely speculating on market conditions." "Of course," Walter nodded, "purely hypothetical." That night, I drafted an email to Margaret outlining an acquisition opportunity that would solve our manufacturing constraints and give us access to complementary product lines and customer relationships. This could crush Sophia, I thought, my fingers pausing over the keyboard with grim satisfaction. I wasn't orchestrating Steel Pulse's downfall. Sophia and her investors were doing that all by themselves. I was simply positioning Cascade to pick up the pieces and save those 250 jobs in the process. For the next month, I focused entirely on strengthening Cascade's operations. We implemented new inventory controls, streamlined production flows, and established clear quality standards. More importantly, I rebuilt their supplier relationships using the same approach that had worked at Steel Pulse: personal connections, mutual benefit, and long-term thinking. "Your methods are already turning heads," a supplier told me, his tone hinting at Steel Pulse's struggles. Meanwhile, Steel Pulse's situation deteriorated exactly as I'd predicted, not because I interfered, but because Sophia's aggressive cost-cutting and impersonal vendor management created natural consequences. 3 more clients suspended orders this week, Daniel texted me. "Production's running at 35% capacity. They've started layoffs. It's a sinking ship," he added, his words heavy with despair. I forwarded the update to Margaret, adding it to the acquisition case I was building. "Steel Pulse is imploding," I wrote, my words sharp with certainty. She'd been initially skeptical but was coming around as the financial advantages became clearer. "If we move, it needs to be soon," she responded. "Strike while they're weak," she urged, her tone fierce with strategy. "Before they lose too much value." The following Monday, I received an unexpected visitor at Cascade. James Carter, my contact from Nexus Dynamics, showed up unannounced. "Got time for lunch?" he asked. "We need to talk, Ethan. Now," he pressed, his urgency setting my nerves on edge. Over burgers at a nearby diner, he explained his presence. "We're pulling all our business from Steel Pulse. Can't rely on them anymore." "Sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in seeing good people hurt by bad leadership. "We need a new supplier," James continued. "Someone who can deliver the components we need without drama. Someone like Cascade." I set down my burger. "We don't currently manufacture the same components as Steel Pulse." "But you could," James smiled. "With the right equipment and expertise." "You're the only one I trust to deliver," he said, his voice low with conviction. "Hypothetically, yes. What if I told you Nexus is prepared to sign a 4-year contract with significant volume guarantees, enough to justify setting up a new production line? This wasn't just an opportunity for Cascade, it was leverage for the acquisition. A guaranteed customer base would make Steel Pulse's assets and workforce even more valuable to us." "I'd need to discuss it with Margaret," I said, "but it's certainly interesting." When I brought the proposal to Margaret that afternoon, along with updated information on Steel Pulse's declining situation, she made her decision. "Make them an offer," she said. "Let's bury Sophia's legacy," she added, her eyes glinting with resolve. "But do it through Walter first. Test the waters before we show our full hand." I called Walter that evening and outlined the plan. He would approach Sophia's investment group, presenting himself as a concerned former owner with a potential lifeline, an interested buyer willing to acquire Steel Pulse at a reduced but fair price. "Won't mention Cascade or you initially," Walter confirmed. "Just gauge their desperation. They'll never see you coming," he said, his voice alive with anticipation. Perfect. 4 days later, Walter called back. "They bit harder than I expected, barely negotiated. They want out before next quarter's financials hit. They're running scared," he laughed, savoring their panic. "Did they ask who the buyer is?" "Of course. I told them a private investment group. They didn't push, they're too eager to stop the bleeding." We moved quickly after that. Margaret assembled the acquisition team, with me providing detailed information on Steel Pulse's assets, capabilities, and remaining strengths. "We're saving what Sophia destroyed," Margaret declared, her voice fierce with purpose. "We structured the deal to retain as many employees as possible, people I knew personally whose skills and dedication deserved better than what Sophia had given them. 2 weeks later, with the preliminary agreement in place, it was time to reveal Cascade as the buyer and me as the architect of the acquisition. The meeting was set for Tuesday morning at Steel Pulse's headquarters, exactly 4 months after my very public dismissal. I selected my suit carefully that morning, not to impress Sophia, but out of respect for the moment. This was my reckoning, I thought, steeling myself for her reaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. I walked into Steel Pulse's conference room at precisely 9:00 IEMA, followed by Margaret and our legal team. Sophia's face when she saw me was worth every sleepless night of the past 4 months. "What is this?" she demanded, looking from me to Walter to her investors. "Mr. Harper is here representing the acquiring company," Walter explained calmly. "You can't be serious," Sophia snapped, her composure shattering. "This is a joke." Sophia stood up. "We're not selling to him." The lead investor, a thin man named Robert Langley, cleared his throat. "The preliminary agreement has been signed. Cascade Systems is acquiring Steel Pulse's assets, and Mr. Harper will be overseeing the integration." "You can't do this," she insisted. "He's the reason we're in this situation. He sabotaged our vendor relationships." I remained standing, hands clasped behind my back. "You burned those bridges yourself," I said, my voice cutting through her protests. "I haven't contacted a single Steel Pulse vendor since my departure. I'd be happy to provide phone records, emails, and sworn statements confirming that fact." "Then how do you explain—" "What you're experiencing," I interrupted calmly, "is the natural consequence of treating business relationships as transactions rather than partnerships. Those vendors didn't need me to tell them how little you valued them." Margaret stepped forward, taking control of the meeting. "We're here to finalize the acquisition terms. Cascade will retain majority ownership, with Walter maintaining his current stake. We'll keep the Steel Pulse brand and as many employees as operations can support." Sophia looked to Robert and the other investors for support, but found none. They were cutting their losses, and she was just another liability to shed. "What about me?" she finally asked. Margaret glanced at me, then back to Sophia. "Your time here is over," Margaret said, her tone final. "Your services won't be needed during the transition or beyond." Sophia gathered her papers with shaking hands. "You planned this from the beginning," she accused me. "You set me up to fail." I shook my head. "No, Sophia. You did that all by yourself when you decided that relationships didn't matter, when you dismissed 8 years of work without taking the time to understand it. You'll pay for this, Ethan," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. She left without another word. The investors stayed, eager to complete the deal that would salvage at least part of their investment. I felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that justice had been served. 7 months later, I stood on the manufacturing floor of the newly integrated Cascade Steel Pulse operation. We'd kept 235 of the original 250 jobs, consolidated administrative functions, and expanded production capabilities. Most importantly, we'd rebuilt the vendor relationships that had made Steel Pulse successful in the first place. It took time, trust, and transparency, explaining our vision, honoring past commitments, and creating new partnerships built on mutual respect. "You brought us back to life," a worker told me, his gratitude heavy with relief. The combined company was on track to hit $25 million, 0 cents in annual revenue, nearly double what Steel Pulse had achieved at its peak. Margaret had made good on her equity promise, making me a minority owner with real skin in the game. As I completed my daily walkthrough, Daniel, now our production manager, approached with a tablet. "Northwest Components just confirmed the new delivery schedule," he reported, "and Pacific Parts agreed to the quality improvement program, said they appreciate the return to the old way of doing business." "Good. Let's visit them both next month, see the improvements firsthand." Daniel nodded. "By the way, heard anything about Sophia? Consulting for a private equity firm in Seattle, last I heard. Think she learned anything from all this?" I considered the question as we walked past workers assembling medical imaging equipment alongside automation systems, the integrated product lines that gave us our competitive edge. "She's probably blaming everyone but herself," I said, picturing her defiant exit. "Probably not the right lesson," I finally answered. "People rarely do." That evening, I stayed late reviewing plans for our next expansion. Walter stopped by on his way out, a golf trip planned for the weekend. You proved your point, he said, leaning against my office doorway. Built it back better than before. You turned her failure into our victory, he added, his grin wide with pride. Wasn't about proving a point, Walter smiled. Sure, Ethan. Whatever helps you sleep at night. I returned to my paperwork after he left, but my mind drifted to that day by the Columbia when I sat watching barges fight the current. Sometimes going with the flow isn't the answer. Sometimes you have to push back. Not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet determination. I hadn't set out to destroy Sophia or to take over Steel Pulse. I'd simply refused to let good work be undone by someone who couldn't see its value. That was revenge enough.